All right, we're going to try to get started. We have a lot of material that we're going to try to cover in 2 hours. So we're going to actually be doing speed education over here. I see that the is very popular today. I was going to sit here and say, I know I had a presentation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I want to thank Joanne Gagliardi, our host today. So, Joanne, if you want to come up, say a couple words. We absolutely love Joanne, and we absolutely love Capital One. So,
you guys. Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure if this is the first time many of you might have been here. If so, just so you know, before we get started, the facilities for the ladies and the gentlemen bathrooms are at the exit doors, so the alarms won't go off, so you can just help yourself over there. And I just want to thank you all for being here. I just left a 2-page flyer. It's not as big as David's for Certilman's book, so not to overwhelm you, but just wanted to let you know this is our 25th anniversary for Capital One actually being a retail bank. Rich Fairbanks, the founding father, everyone knows that we're a credit card company. He decided 25 years ago to enter into the area of retail banking, non-for-profit business banking. So I am the business banker here at Capital One, and we're all about the community. And if anyone has any questions afterwards, I'd love to speak to you. But enjoy today's seminar, and I look forward to speaking to you all later. Thank you.
If anyone's looking for a personal banker, it doesn't get much more personal. Anyway, so everybody should have little folders in front of them. All the materials are in there. I just want to go over a couple of things to begin with. First of all, this is being done both in person and on a webinar. So we have a microphone. So if anybody has questions as we go through this, just get our attention. We'll get the microphone over to you. And please wait till you have the microphone, because the people on the webinar can't hear you if you speak without a microphone. So we're going to try to get the microphone over to you as quickly as possible. As we go through this, I like being interrupted. Okay, I like questions. You don't really want to hear me sit here and drone on about things for 40 minutes. So if anybody has questions, please just jump in, ask the questions. That's what we're here for. The more you get out of it, the happier I am. So also within the folder, there's some stuff about the Imagine Awards. The deadline for the Imagine Awards is this Friday. If people don't know about the Imagine Awards, I think you guys live under a rock, because we've been trying to push this thing for a long time. But if you don't know about the Imagine Awards, come see us afterwards and I'll explain it. I'm not going to go over it now. There's a board guide in there. We've reissued our board guide this summer. So it's a source for board members. So if you don't have one, if you need more, let us know, we'll get you more. Okay, so let's get started. So apparently I'm going to be talking about the role of the board versus the role of management. So just so I get a feel for how many people in this room are board members. So a lot of you. How many of you are of management of a nonprofit organization? A few less of you. How many of you are just here for the free food? There's a couple of you. All right. So I know that there's a delicate dance that goes on between boards and management, and boards and the CEO. And we often find a lot of times that you have organizations that might have a strong CEO and they dominate the board, and other times where board sometimes micromanages an organization. So, you know, what is the right mix for a board and a CEO? All right. So let's first start about the effective relationship and what constitutes an effective relationship between a board and a CEO. So you really want to have well-defined job responsibilities. All right. So I know a lot of times employees have job responsibilities, but often job responsibilities aren't really created for the executive director. So every organization should have job responsibilities for the executive director, which outlines what the role of the executive director is. And there should also be job responsibilities for the board members, so the board members understand what their roles are also. so that, the board needs to understand that they function as a board. They don't function as, they come to the table with individual thoughts and individual ideas, but they're making decisions as a board. So you shouldn't have one loose cannon on a board that's kind of going into the organization and kind of disrupting things. And I've seen that happen a lot of times. Remember, boards govern, staff manages. So the board sets policy, and board creates the roadmap for the organization to use. The executive director then creates procedures to ensure that those policies are being met. The executive director kind of drives the bus along the map that the board has created for them. But again, the board governs. It's the board's responsibility to make sure that the overarching principles of the organization are being met. And it's the executive director's responsibility to ensure that the direction that's been created by the board is being followed. The boards also provide advice. You want to try to bring together a group of individuals on a board that come from different backgrounds, that have different expertise, that can provide different information, so that the executive director has a resource or a sounding board to bounce things off of. And that's important. So again, the board is there to help ensure that the mission of the organization is properly met, and it's the executive director's role to kind of follow through with that. You need to have effective communication. Every relationship is based on communication. When I don't communicate with my wife, I'm in trouble. Well, when I wake up in the morning, I'm in trouble, but that's besides the point. So you're in a situation where you need to have that effective communication. That communication usually starts between the executive director and the board chairman. So you really need to have a board chairman who's going to take a very active role in the process. A lot of times board chairmen take on the responsibility of being a board chairman without truly understanding what that means. And if you're going to take on the responsibility of board chairman, you have to understand what that means. It means more than just showing up at meetings. It means that there needs to be regular communication between the executive director and yourself. It means that you need to have or control the flow of what's happening at a board meeting and everything else. So that board chairman is an important role. And again, that's why those job responsibilities become important. You need to take responsibility seriously. One side, as I mentioned before, should not carry or dominate the relationship. It shouldn't be, and I've been to meetings where, the board of directors is really just there as a fundraising arm of the organization, and the executive director just runs the whole organization. That's not what it's all about. The board is supposed to provide oversight to the organization, and the board is actually the executive director's boss. And you got to kind of think of it that way. If the executive director is not effective, it's the board's responsibility to replace that executive director, right? So the executive director is the boss. I'm sorry, the board is the executive director's boss. And then think about it, the relationship that exists between the executive director and the board, that management board relationship, really sets the tone for the whole organization. If I've got a bad relationship and I've got a poor tone at the top, that's going to trickle down into the organization. So that's extremely important. So let's talk about the board first, and then we'll get into the executive director. So there are certain overarching principles. The board provides oversight and guidance, right? So that's what the board does. They're there to provide guidance. They're there to provide oversight. They're not there to, again, dive into the weeds. The weeds and the day-to-day operations are the domain of the executive director. The board's responsible for making sure that the operations are aligned with the missions, values, and the exempt purpose of the organization. So when you think about it, the organization has a mission. One of the things I always say to board members when I talk to them is, have that mission almost taped in front of you when you sit at a board meeting so that you understand why you're in the room. The purpose that the board is in the room is to ensure that that mission is being met. So when you're making decisions and you're providing guidance and direction for the organization, those decisions, guidance, and direction should be all based upon what that mission statement is and what you're trying to accomplish. A lot of times what will end up happening also is you get what's known as mission creep, where you have an organization that starts off with one purpose, one mission, and then they go off on a tangent because either they're following funding or something else has happened. understand that you got to be very, very careful. And I know David will probably talk about this when he goes through the whole snafu section of the presentation. But you got to be very, very careful about mission creep, because you were given tax exempt status and you were incorporated to do specific things. And if you go outside of what you were incorporated to do, or you go outside of what your mission statement is, you could jeopardize the organization. So you have to be very careful you understand and keep true to the mission. I'll give you an example of one, and David, I'm sorry if I'm stealing any of your thunder. But let me just finish the thought and then we had a situation with a client that David and I worked with, and the organization was set up to provide a whole lot of services for the developmentally disabled population. So they had a whole laundry list of services, and they decided that they wanted to add early intervention services to the services that they provided. They went out and hired an attorney. That was not David. They went out and hired an attorney, and the attorney, instead of adding it to their services, basically replaced all of the OPWD services with early intervention, and basically said, this is an early intervention organization. And for 6 years, they operated that way. So they really, in all of the OPWD services they were providing, they weren't really following through with what their certificate of incorporation said anymore because they amended it. So again, the board needs to be wary of that. The board needs to understand what its responsibilities are, and they need to make sure that the organization stays true to the legal documents and true to their mission. Question over here. Paul is bringing the mic.
How does this apply to working boards?
To what?
Working boards?
So when you think about a working board versus a fundraising board, if that's kind of the thought you have in mind here, I think all boards should be working boards. I think all boards should be in a situation where they're providing direction and governance. If you're talking about an organization maybe that doesn't have an executive director because it's a volunteer organization and there's no paid staff, then yeah, you're not going to have that relationship of an executive director and board, but it still comes down to determining what the job responsibilities of each person on the board is. You really need to set the parameters and set the responsibilities, because if you don't set the responsibilities, you got everybody running around in circles not knowing what they're supposed to be doing. If you don't set the responsibilities, you got people stepping on each other's toes. You've got different personalities and different opinions. So I think no matter what you do, you need to really define roles of people, whether that be a working board where there's no executive director and then the board does everything, or you're in a situation where there is a board and an executive director, and then you need to create those clear lines of delineation as to who's responsible for what. Hopefully that answered the question. Forgot where. Okay, policy development. It's the board's role to create policy. As I said, that's one of the primary roles of the board. You know, what is the policies of the organization? And there are a bunch of different policies. We'll be talking about a bunch of them later, but there's a bunch of different policies that come into play. And again, the board sets policy, the board doesn't implement policy. And we've seen that a lot in organizations too, where the board sets policy and then they want to go in and micromanage what's happening within the organization. That should never be happening. A board sets organizational direction. So the board sets the tone in terms of where the organization is going. They can get guidance, and they should get guidance from management and from the executive director, and it should be collaborative in a lot of the processes that take place. But it's really the board whose job it is to set the tone of the organization. So the types of things that the board should be thinking about is, you know, a lot of times if you think about how management works, you know, and you were kind of mapping out a picture of what management looks like, too often organizational management gets bogged down in what's happening today, right? They get focused on putting out fires and the need to deal with what's happening in the here and now. The board's role is to kind of think more strategically and think more long range, so that the board can actually provide that clear path in terms of the direction that the organization should be going in, and kind of help management to think about those things and work towards reaching those goals. Because again, sometimes management does get too bogged down in what's happening on a day-to-day basis. Question in the back.
I understand the role of the board and the executive director and how to set policy and procedures, et cetera. Now, where do the donors come in? Because there's, I think, engaging them, if you're actually giving them what they are thinking that they're getting. Engagement, in an engagement study as opposed to a feasibility study that people do. So where do the donors or funders come in?
Well, I mean, the donors obviously are, in a lot of organizations, the lifeblood of the organization. It's that flow of cash that's coming into the organization. Donors should not be involved in this equation at all, because the donor should not be influencing the direction of the organization. The donor should not be influencing the board management relationship. Both the board and the and management should be involved in the fundraising process. And the board actually that's a key role of what the board needs to be doing is fundraising. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through this. But a key role of the board is to make sure that the organization has the discretionary funds that the organization needs to move forward. And it's also important for the board to decide what type of funds are necessary. A lot of times you see boards establish, they say, hey, we want to raise money for scholarships, or we want to raise money for a specific purpose. And if they're not really well informed, they'll raise money for a specific purpose at the cost of, unrestricted dollars for the organization, which the organization needs to function on a daily basis. So there really needs to be that flow of information and that communication going back and forth between management and the board, so that the board really understands the condition that the organization is in. But the donor should not be part of this equation at all. The donor is there to help fund the organization, but it's not there to influence the decisions being made, or shouldn't be there to influence the decisions being made. Okay. The other thing that the board does from an overarching principle is strategic thinking. As I said before, the organization, the board sets the tone and sets the direction for the organization. There should be regular strategic planning that takes place, and the board needs to be instrumental in that strategic planning process. And that, again, should be done in conjunction with management. It shouldn't be done in a vacuum. And a lot of this stuff, I'm trying to create, what the different roles of each are, but there is some overlap, and there needs to be that communication and collaboration between the two sides. So let's talk about some specific things that the board's involved in. So the first one is legal oversight, bless you. The first one's legal oversight, and David's going to be talking a little bit more about the legal oversight when he gets into his section. So I'm going to go through this a little quicker. But the first part of it is ensure that the organization is operating in accordance, as I said before, with its mission, purpose, and exempt purpose and exempt status. And in accordance with that, you have to ensure that the organization has in place the right governing documents, and that the organization is following those governing documents. And again, David will talk about that more a little bit later. The board's responsibility is to identify risks, right? So the board needs to identify risk and determine how the organization is going to deal with risk management. So in order for the board to do that, the board really needs to understand how the organization operates. I think a lot of times people get onto boards of directors and they come and they show up for a meeting, and then a month later or a quarter later, whenever the next meeting is, they show up without really diving into the organization and without there really being any true orientation that happens when a board member comes on. There needs to be that orientation when a board member comes on to a board of an organization. The board needs to understand how an organization operates, because how can I govern something if I don't understand what I'm governing? So it's really important for that to happen. And it's really important, like I said, from a risk perspective. And when you think about risks, you think about government audits that are happening. If you're government funded, it's likely that there's going to be an audit that takes place of the government funding. So how do you know whether you have in place proper compliance, whether you have in place, quality assurance? Should you be looking at that? Should there be regular reporting to the board from these individuals? Do you have an internal audit function within a larger organization? Small organizations typically don't. Discretionary funds. Where are you from a discretionary funds perspective? Do you have enough discretionary funds for the organization? So you really need to understand the organization if you're going to govern it effectively. And then the board is responsible for understanding the laws that impact the organization. Every organization has laws. You can kind of go right through all the different levels of laws. You got the Nonprofit Revitalization Act. You got the New York Prudent Management of Institutional Fund Act. You've got benefits laws in terms of Department of Labor regulations. You got pension regulations. There's so many different laws and regulations that influence any business, and a nonprofit organization is no different. It's a business. So you're in a situation that you've got all these different laws and regulations. That's why it's important to have a good cross-section on your board so that people can come with information and understanding. And if that expertise doesn't exist on the board, it's important to understand that that there are people who you can tap into who have those resources and can kind of educate the board.
Hi, good morning. How are you? My name is Ken Patrick. I think you just said something key where, you know, people get invited to be on all types of boards, but do you think they should change their thinking to look at it and operate it as it's a business? Because you hear nonprofit, and I feel like that affects a lot of the lackadaisical activity versus thinking of a nonprofit as a business. I want to get your thoughts on that, if you can elaborate on that more.
Sure, no problem. So we're going to remove the whole concept of nonprofit organization, because that's a misnomer. There's no such thing as a nonprofit organization. We're going to call it a tax-exempt organization, because the organization was given tax-exempt status because the benefit it provides to the community is greater than the tax dollars that the government would have collected. So that's kind of the concept of why an organization becomes tax-exempt. No organization should be nonprofit. There should be no situation where we're doing things to lose money. We got to this to help people. How do we help people? We help people by having money to be able to spend on helping people. So it is a business. It's the business of helping people, okay? And that's how you have to look at it. And if you look at it as, oh, we're just a nonprofit, you're looking at it completely wrong. It is a business. It needs to be run like a business. It needs to function like a business. It needs to consider business terms and business concepts. Otherwise, you're doing a disservice to the people you serve. No problem. So again, it's important that you understand the laws and regulations. And each funding source that you have is going to have different contracts. And within those contracts are different rules and regulations that exist within the contracts. If you're SED funded, State Education Department funded, you better know about the reimbursable cost manual. And if you don't know about the reimbursable cost manual, then you're missing the boat. So I'm not saying that the board of directors has to live in the detail of the regulations, but the board of directors needs to know enough about the regulations to be able to ask questions and to probe. And that's part of the board's responsibility too. The board's responsibility is to ask questions. It's to probe, it's to understand. You know, if something doesn't feel right, you need to ask about it. Question.
Hi, Hillary Needle. It's not
You're
so
not
much,
allowed to probe and ask questions.
I'm not probing, but is it the responsibility of the executive director, or let's say the board chair, to properly educate or mentor the new incoming board members?
I would say it's the responsibility of the executive director to inform and to ensure that the person who's coming onto the board has the information necessary to have a good fundamental background as to what's happening within the organization. And it's the responsibility of the board chairman to ensure that the individuals coming onto the board understands what their role is, understands what's expected of them, understands and is there to provide mentor either directly or through another board member. Because let me ask you a question. Would you go to your administrative assistant, okay, and say to your administrative assistant, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to mentor me and guide me. Okay, but think about it. The executive director answers to the board. So if I've got a board member who's going to the executive director and saying, mentor me and guide me.
So how does it happen where sometimes we need to clean house on a board with ineffective board members? How do you see that happening out there in the market?
That is the role of the chairman of the board and the rest of the board to self-police. It is not the role of the executive director to go out and fire board members. Okay, I mean, you could have communication. An executive director feels that a board member is ineffective, and if the executive director feels like a board member is managing, sorry, the microphone just keeps. That's what the role of those meetings between the executive director and the chairman of the board should be discussing. And there should be regular meetings between the executive director and the chairman of the board. moving along. So the role of the board is safe of public trust. So the organization is, I'm sorry, the board is responsible for protecting the organization's resources, right? So the organization has assets, and it's the board's role to ensure that the organization is running effectively so that those assets are maintained. All right, so if the board sees that an organization is losing money or running into problems within a specific program, there should be questions asked. There should be, why are we doing this program? What benefit does it provide to our mission? Is it really core to what we're doing, or should we get rid of it? Because again, if I'm in a situation where I've got a part of my business that's dragging me down and could be jeopardizing the rest of the business, shouldn't I be asking those questions? Shouldn't I be wondering, hey, is this really the right thing for this organization to be doing? They need to monitor compliance with government regulations. Again, we'll go back to what I said. Board sets policy. Management, executive director, they implement policy and ensure that the policy being met. The board then is responsible for monitoring that what's happening within the organization in conjunction with the policies they've established is happening effectively, right? So the board implements, the board sets policy and monitors that the implementation by management is done appropriately. Ensure donor restrictions are being met. The board, although management is the one who's going in and dealing with the day-to-day stuff, the board needs to ensure that management knows what it's doing, understands, and is following donor restrictions, because that's, again, the board's responsible for legal requirements, and a donor restriction is a legal requirement. And also ensuring that the control environment is effective. The board is not creating the control environment. They're laying out the overarching principles, but then they need to monitor. And a lot of that comes through questions and answers. A lot of that comes through communicating with the audit team. So if an organization has an annual audit that takes place, we go in and we try to meet with the boards of directors, and it's amazing. We get on the calendar to meet with the board, and they'll say, okay, you got 10 minutes to present. Well, great, I can present in 10 minutes, but you're only gonna get a 10-minute presentation. You know, the boards that I like to work with are the ones who say, okay, I'm gonna give you an hour. Go through with me and let me know what's happening within my organization. Let me know where the bodies are buried. Let me know what the problems are, because I think that's where the importance is. You know, the more that you can get information from experts, the better off you're going to be. Not that I profess to be an expert. Go ahead.
So you're spot on. I definitely understand what you're saying. I guess the risk is that you're going to disenfranchise some potential board members who don't want to put that work in. And that's a challenge. And I guess the point is that if you're a board member, you have to know the responsibilities you're getting into. This is not to be taken lightly. This is heavy-weighted stuff, and you ring true in this. And I just hope that board members realize that, because this is a weighty responsibility.
That's why I really like board agreements. I like organizations to create a board agreement that outlines what it is the responsibilities of the board are. Because if I have a board agreement that outlines responsibilities, if a board member comes on, they know what the responsibilities are because it's already been in an agreement and they've already signed off on it. I actually just got the notice that I've got 10 minutes left and I'm on like slide 4. So I'm going to try to speed this up a little. I apologize. So again, the board is a safeguard of public trust, protecting the organization, monitoring compliance, ensuring donor restrictions are being met, ensuring control environment. They have a fiscal oversight, near and dear to my heart. They set and approve the annual budget. All right, so they're going to set the budget. They don't prepare the budget. Management prepares the budget. They review it, ask questions, and they approve the budget. The budget becomes the overarching principle that management works under, right? So I establish a budget. The budget says I can spend this much money in different areas. That's really, again, the fiscal roadmap for the management to follow. They have to ensure fiscal restraint, proper reserves are maintained. They need to understand the fiscal operations. So there needs to be those, budget to actual comparisons that they can understand how the organization is doing in comparison to the budget that was established. Again, that's the monitoring principle of the fiscal component. Again, having that conversation with the auditors, getting regular, I'm a firm believer that when management provides information to the board on how an organization is doing, there should be dashboards, there should be charts and graphs. Most board members are made up of individuals with diverse backgrounds. Not all of them have that fiscal background. If I throw a bunch of numbers in front of someone, their eyes start to roll up in the back of their head, they start to drool. They're just not getting all of this stuff. If I can put it in an easy way for them to understand, by giving them charts and graphs and showing them things that are important for them to understand. Liquidity, what's the bankability of my organization? How many days in cash do I have? What sort of cash flow concerns am I looking at? What are the driving factors? So if I'm a school, one of the driving factors is enrollment. What's my enrollment look like? You know, so if I can give the board information, then teach the board to understand how the different triggers work, the board then becomes much more informed and can do the job much better. And the board needs to help in the fundraising aspect. I know somebody asked before what the part of the role of the board is to raise money for an organization. If a board member is not, and I hear all the time, you know, give or get, you know, so a board member should have a give or get responsibility. I'm sorry, I disagree with that. A board member should have a give and get responsibility. There should be no or in there. It should be a give and get responsibility. Every board member should be making a contribution to the organization they sit on. If I'm going to go and I'm going to ask someone to give money and they say to me, well, how much did you give? Well, I gave nothing, but it doesn't send the right message. There needs to be a give and get. I don't like that word or, get rid of it. Throw it out of your vocabulary. So roles of the executive director in 5 minutes. Sorry. Well, good that there are more board members here. So the executive director is responsible for overarching principles, I guess, right? Where's my overarching principle slide? There we go. They're the face of the organization, right? People don't run to the board. They run to the executive director. So the executive director needs to be the face of the organization. They're the ones who need to kind of present out there. They're there to execute policies, programs, and board. They drive the bus, right? So the board created the roadmap, and they're the ones who drive the bus and make sure we get from point A to point B. They run the day-to-day operations. They are the quarterback. It is not the board's responsibility to get involved in the day-to-day operations. That's the executive director's role. They get involved in the strategic planning with the board. They need to have that strong communication and collaboration and relationship with the board to keep the board informed. The information is from the executive director. So they need to push that information up to the board so the board has information they need to make decisions. I don't know why the microphone keeps doing that. The next thing that the board is responsible is for staff management. So again, sorry, that. If you think about it, it's not the board's responsibility to hire the individuals within the organization. The board hires the executive director. The board reviews the executive director. The board either fires or keeps the executive director. The executive director then goes and hires the team that they're going to use to move the organization forward. It's the board's responsibility to hire the executive director's responsibility to hire all of the staff. The board monitors that through the budget. So the board gave a budget and said, within the budget, you can spend X number of dollars on staffing. As long as the executive director works within the context of that budget, they're fulfilling their obligation. So it's really the executive director's role to hire, supervise, ensure organization is properly staffed, ensure job descriptions are set in place, oversee staff reviews and everything else, and be able to communicate effectively with the board. And some of those people who the executive director hires should be communicating with the board. If you've got a compliance officer, there should be regular communication with the compliance officer and the board, right? That should be happening. The board should understand and talk to some of the program people, because if they don't talk to the program people, how an organization is generating its revenue, and how can I govern an organization that I don't understand? The executive director is responsible for development and management of the policies and programs. So again, I'm going to manage programs. I'm going to create procedures to go with those policies. They are the staff liaison to the board. Again, as I said before, they report and they bring information back to the board, right? So the executive director is the one who's involved in the day-to-day operations. They're the ones who are involved in all aspects of running the organization. So they're the ones who have the information that they can bring to the board and inform the board as to what's happening. And then it's the board's job to ask and probe and make sure that they understand the information that's being presented. They're responsible to ensure effective operations, right? They're responsible for making sure that they're functioning in line with the mission, that they're functioning within the budget that was created by the board, that they understand the regulations and they're staying informed as to what the regulations are. And again, part of the way the board understands regulations is because management is bringing that information to the board. Ensuring all staff are pulling together to meet the mission of the organization. They're there, as I said, the quarterback. You know, think of almost like the board as the coach who sends in the plays, and then the executive director is the quarterback who ensures that everybody's kind of functioning and everybody knows the playbook and everything else. And if you're a Jet or Giant fan, I'm sorry. So some of the takeaways. Role of the board is to govern, monitor, not to do. The board should demand appropriate information, stay informed, and be able to effectively govern the organization. So they should be regular reporting from staff. There should be fiscal and regular analysis. There should be committee summaries. One of the things that I'm a firm believer in is the board can't do everything, right? So if I can establish committees and have the committees focus on different aspects of what's happening within the organization, and then have those committees provide summaries and reports back to the board, we get a lot more done with this, at the board level, because now the board is much more informed. The committees are kind of diving into the weeds. That comes to your working board type thing. If I'm a larger organization, I may not have a working board, but I might have working committees within that structure. And then the board really is able to read all the reports and everything else and have a deeper understanding. It's incumbent upon each board member to attend meetings, be prepared. You should be reading through materials. If there are committee meetings and minutes and everything else, I attend a lot of board meetings. And, you know, one of the questions that comes up at the beginning of every board meeting is, you know, we want to approve the minutes. Does anybody make a recommendation to approve the minutes? Seconded. Did anybody read the minutes? You know, and it's, oh, you read the minutes, Christine? Okay. But the point is, did anybody read that? But I think a lot of times what ends up happening within organizations, and one of the things that I kind of like is there's one organization that I'm involved in, and one of the things they do at the bottom of every minute, at the end of the minutes, they put in action plans and who's responsible for what. And I kind of like that. And whether it goes in the minutes or it's outside of the minutes, there should be some takeaways. So when I leave the meeting, people know what responsibilities they have coming out of the meeting. People are going to look at it 2 days before the next meeting anyway and try to do it in those last 2 days. But at least there's something there that they understand what their responsibilities are coming out of the meeting. But you need to be prepared. You know, time doesn't stop between meetings. It's a fluid process. And I think what you find a lot of times with boards is they go to one meeting, time stops. They show up at the next meeting. You know, it doesn't happen. There needs to be stuff that happens in between the 2 points. The board is the governing body, not individual chairs. I said that before. The board governs as a group, all right? So you shouldn't have one person who's running, you know, over everybody else on the board. It should be the board making group decisions. The board is responsible for policing itself. And that was, I think, a question, Hillary, you asked. The board is responsible for policing itself. It's not the executive director's responsibility to go and fire their boss. You know, the chairman of the board is responsible for ensuring that everybody's pulling together on the board, just like it's the executive director's responsibility to ensure that everybody's pulling together within the organization. Question in the back.
No. To that note, do you have any templates for board of self-evaluations that you could share?
I don't. We can probably track one out for you. So you have a job when you get back to the office? Okay. Question on the end of, go ahead. And then we'll go. Christine.
Yes, the executive board polices itself. It's not the job of the executive director, but does the chairman of the board, does he have to approve what the board is suggesting the executive board itself? Because I have that issue going on right now.
Okay, so in terms of the chairman or chairwoman of a board, so whether, is it that person's responsibility to really agree with the board? No. I mean, the board, it really comes down to whatever your bylaws say in terms of decision making. There are some organizations where the chairman doesn't even have a vote unless there's a tie within the board, and then the chairman will cast the deciding vote. But it really, whatever the bylaws state, the chairman has one vote like everybody else, but the chairman is responsible for ensuring that the board functions effectively. That is the role of the chairman. Christine, question on the end.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I just really wanted to respond to the self-assessment comment. I just wanted to plug the Adelphi Center for Nonprofit Leadership. Some of you may know it's a fabulous resource, and they have a fabulous self-assessment template. My partner and I are actually doing this for an organization, and we use some of those resources combined with a lot of other things to craft a really effective self-assessment. But that's a great place to start, and everyone should know about it.
So functioning as a chairman of the board, so then if you can send Paula that information, and Paula will forward that to everyone else?
Yes.
Nice, thank you. Tommy has a question.
Hi, I'm Tommy DeMisa. So Ken, my question is sort of around, often I see in startup organizations, folks who become board members are adjacent to the mission, friends, family, things like that. Not always, probably in my assessment, the greatest assets to pick somebody to be on your board. So could you speak to that? And then is there an archetype? Is there like a profile of who I want on my board, things of that nature? I think I gave you a lot there, so.
Okay, I'm already first, so I'm going to make this really, really quick. So in terms of a startup organization and picking family members, a lot of times when an organization first starts, you go to what feels comfortable. You go to the people who are going to help you, who are aligned in your process and everything else. A lot of times those organizations don't have paid staff, and you really need to rely on people to kind of dive in and work. So that's, organizations go through life cycles. So when you're in that life cycle, you know, you're gonna have different types of board members. You're gonna have different types of executive directors. As the organization progresses and it becomes bigger and more structured, then I think you really need to start moving towards a more effective board, or I don't want to say that, that's probably a poor choice of words, but a different type of board. And that different type of board needs to have a good cross section, people with business background, people who understand the programmatic aspects of what the organization does, people who have maybe backgrounds in government or lobbying or whatever. You need to figure out what it is. Think about when you start a company and you're hiring staff for the company. You're looking at, what do I need? What are the skill sets I need within my organization? It's no different. What are the skill sets I need for my board? And then I should be going out and hiring board members to meet the skill sets of what I need. You know, and I've said this before at other presentations, you know, we go through a whole lengthy interview process when we hire a staff person, and too often we're just happy that someone's agreeing to be on our board. But there should be that interview process too for board members. Really, really quick to get through this. Some recommendations. Have a board agreement, I mentioned that before, which includes job responsibilities. Ensure that everybody understands their roles. Develop a formal orientation that when a board member joins the organization, they have an understanding of the organization and its operations. Have an initial meeting between the executive director and the new board member, and I love it when the chairman's there too, so that there's a good grip and understanding of what's happening within the organization. Ask some questions. The questions I like is, what can I do to support you? So if I'm the executive director, what can I do to support you? What will you value most from me? And what information will you need to assist in moving our organization forward? You know, if you can kind of get those thought process and get the new board members thinking the right way, that's great. And then ensure that annual performance reviews of the executive director occur. One of the things that we often see is that the executive director moves on and there's never an evaluation. And I actually love 360 reviews. I love reviews where the board is providing a review down from the top, and then you go to key members of management that answer to the executive director and get their input so that you get a full 360 review of what's happening. Any questions before I hand the phone over to David? Just if you wait till sorry. Only because we have the webinar and people can't hear you.
How does an advisory board fit into this picture?
Advisory boards typically do not provide the governance. So it's the board that provides the governance for an organization. The advisory board is there to advise and provide leadership expertise and things for either the executive director, for the board, or whatever. Typically, the advisory board has some level of special knowledge. Some organizations, what they'll do is they'll have a board of directors that are really geared towards fundraising and bringing money into the organization. And they'll have the advisory board are really the people who are doing the work. It's kind of a little backwards there, but the advisory board in a real environment, if the governing body is the board of directors, the advisory board can provide information and not oversight, but knowledge and stuff, but they're really not there to govern the organization. They have no say in the direction of an organization. Unless, David, you tell me something different. Okay. All right, so thank you. You'll be seeing me again because Matt Burke was supposed to do the third presentation, but he wasn't able to make it today, so I'll be playing the role of Matt Burke later. But I'm going to pass the microphone over to David now.
Good morning, everybody. And I think I really am enjoying the vibrant participation that we've been having. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand, ask questions, interrupt. I think that makes the presentation more productive for everybody involved. So I'm David Goldstein, and I'm a partner and, in fact, the founder of the nonprofit tax-exempt religious organizations practice group at Certilman, Balin, Adler, and Hyman. And I'm going to talk to you about the top 10 governance snafus that we see in our practice involving nonprofits and religious organizations. Let's start with probably the most fundamental and far-reaching snafu, and I think it was touched on a little bit in Ken's presentation and in some of the questions he got. The most consequential snafu that you could have as a director or officer of a nonprofit is losing sight of the fact that you've got, as a director or officer, fiduciary duties, legal duties, and responsibilities under the law. There are a couple of basic precepts here. The first is that directors and officers of nonprofits have legal duties. And the second, which flows from the first, is that there can be personal liability to directors and officers for breaching those legal duties. So what are the three fundamental legal duties of a nonprofit director under New York law? And we're gonna talk about these quickly, and then as we go through the other snafus that we often see, you'll see how they come into play. The three legal duties of a nonprofit director are the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. So we'll start with the duty of care, which is probably the most significant, and that is enshrined in Section 717A of the Not-for-Profit Corporation Law, NPCL. You'll see that abbreviation throughout the presentation. And that basically requires that a director has to discharge the duties of his or her position in good faith and with the care an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances. That's a lot of words. Basically, it comes down to the oversight function that a director of a nonprofit has. And in fact, oversight of everything that the nonprofit does, and we're going to see how broad and also granular that can become. To have that kind of oversight, it'll require familiarity with the organization's finances and activities and regular participation in its governance. And if you want to see how things can go off the rails and how succinctly the duty of care can be used to address that, one of the items in your book of supplementary materials is the Healing Arts Initiative lawsuit from April 2016. And it's a very brief summons that started a litigation against all of the directors of a nonprofit. And it, in probably a paragraph or a paragraph and a half, states that the directors breached their duty of care, and it quotes the verbiage of the statute that we went through a moment ago. And it talks about how there was a complete lack of oversight in terms of negligent supervision of the finances of the organization, negligent hiring, negligent retention of an auditor, and all of that going back to a failure of adequate oversight. So on this slide, it kind of lays out some resources that can help give you some context as to how you can, as a director or officer of a nonprofit or an advisor to a nonprofit, how you can get your arms around what the duty of care is on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis for a nonprofit board. And one of the materials that I always emphasize that people take a look at is right from the start. It's a publication by the Attorney General's Charities Bureau, and it very succinctly lays out the responsibilities of directors of not-for-profit corporations under New York law. And it not only does it tell you what the responsibilities are, but it tells you how, in fact, you can satisfy those responsibilities. Did I see a question?
The executive director or board members?
It's board members.
It's board
under the
members.
law,
Okay.
directors, sometimes synonymous with trustees in certain organizations, but board of directors. The executive director would, as an officer, most of what we're saying would be applicable to the executive director and other officers as well. Another very useful item for you to look at, it's also in your materials, is the Adelphi University lawsuit from 1997, and that really lays out how a board of very sophisticated and experienced and successful people dropped the ball and wound up, many of them with personal liability and certainly lots of reputational damage. One of the takeaways when you read that case, at least one of my takeaways, is it's not enough for a bunch of smart people to sit around and figure out how they would approach something. You really need to have relevant information, expert advice. It's not good enough to be smart, experienced, and make your best guess. And if you read that decision, which is about a 50-page decision, you'll see that that's a lot of what the board did, and it got them into a lot of trouble. A more recent litigation is the unsecured creditor trustee of Dowling College suing 13 members of the board of directors and also the CFO of Dowling. Dowling is in bankruptcy, and that's also a very useful case study of how oversight fails. I should mention that this is an ongoing case. It hasn't been decided. But I think the goal of, certainly my goal as counsel to nonprofits, and I think everyone's goal, if they're on a board or an officer or an advisor to a nonprofit, is not only to make sure that your board doesn't lose a case when they're sued for breach of fiduciary duty, but you don't want to be in that litigation in the first place, because these litigations are very unpleasant, very damaging to people's reputations, and often do result in personal liability. And in fact, and I think this is a really useful thing to be aware of, and it's not a scientific study, really just sort of ad hoc based on my own practice. I've never been involved in this much litigation, both against suing nonprofit boards, which we more and more get asked to do, and more nonprofits are coming and knocking at our door when they've already been sued and their claims of breach of fiduciary duty. So I think partially because of all the publicity around legal duties of nonprofits and the enhanced fiduciary duties that were brought about by the Nonprofit Revitalization Act that was effective in 2014, Ken mentioned that has led to a climate where people are much more aware that they've got an ability to pursue nonprofit directors when they drop the ball. Ken alluded to internal controls, and in your materials there's a wonderful publication, again by the Attorney General's Charities Bureau, about internal controls and financial accountability for nonprofit boards. Policies and procedures are vital there, and having a competent and experienced nonprofit accounting firm develop those policies and procedures are critical. Finally, in terms of a roadmap of what the duty of care constitutes, it's useful to look at the critical role of audit oversight. We may have time to talk about it a little later in more detail. The only committee that has a section of the not-for-profit corporation law dedicated to its functioning is the audit committee. And that's a critical committee. There are many requirements that apply to the audit committee and its functioning. Primary is the independence requirement under the statute, under the not-for-profit corporation law. And in fact, Section 712A, which is the section that deals with audit committees, goes into great detail in terms of what the oversight that's required needs to be. And I certainly can say that in my experience, where there's been any kind of financial fraud or embezzlement, in every one of those instances that have walked into my door after the unfortunate event has happened, and they're trying to either clean it up or address a litigation or address an attorney general investigation resulting from that. Had the audit committee been functioning appropriately, in every instance that I've seen, the situation would have been avoided. We've got a question.
David, on the board in which I serve, the executive director sits on every committee. Should the executive director sit on the audit committee?
No, the executive director should not sit on the audit committee. The executive director can resource the audit committee, can provide information and questions, but certainly the executive director shouldn't sit on the audit committee, because a big piece of what the audit committee is doing is oversight of the executive director and the executive director's own stewardship. So yes, be a resource, yes, provide information, but no, don't sit on the audit committee if you're the executive director.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so the second duty is the duty of loyalty, and we'll get to the snafus, don't worry. But again, I want to stress the primary snafu, and that's why we're spending so much time, is not realizing that you've got these duties. So duty of loyalty, director has to act in the interest of the organization, and this requires an undivided allegiance to the organization's mission when using the power of his or her position or information concerning the organization or its property. And where we see this duty of loyalty play out most frequently is in the area of conflicts of interest and related party transactions. And you'll be reassured to know, probably not, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, that of all of the 50 states in the District of Columbia, New York has by far the most vigorous and demanding conflicts of interest and related party transaction rules, so much so that the IRS had its lawyers develop a sample conflicts of interest policy for 501c3s. And if you're a New York nonprofit and you use that, you are by definition breaching extensively the requirements of the not-for-profit corporation law. So New York has incredibly demanding requirements, and plaintiffs are aware of that. For sure, the Attorney General is aware of that since they wrote those requirements. So that's one of the first things people look at when they want to exercise some leverage against a board. The third duty is the duty of obedience, and this is the third of the legal duties that is the underpinning of a director's service and responsibility, and also that of officers. It's the least understood and the most often neglected of the three primary legal duties, because the other two legal duties, duty of care and duty of loyalty, exist in the for-profit world. The duty of obedience is strictly a not-for-profit corporation law concept. What is the duty of obedience? It's to ensure that the organization complies with applicable laws and regulations and its internal governance documents and policies. Compliance with applicable laws and regulations is even more difficult than it sounds, because you've got multiple layers of laws and regulations, and I think Ken alluded a little bit to that. You've got federal law, you've got state law, and very often you've got local law. And one place you can see all three being relevant at the same time is in the area of lobbying. There are federal restrictions on lobbying. There are for nonprofits, for 501c3s. There's a state lobbying law, and many municipalities, including New York City, have a separate lobbying law, and none of the three are the same. So just in that one area, there are at least three different standards you need to be aware of. The second part of the duty of obedience is compliance with internal governance documents and policies, and the two main fundamental corporate documents that come into play are the Certificate of Incorporation and Bylaws, and more about that later. So the second governance snafu is the use of email. So under the Nonprofit Revitalization Act, the use of email was greatly expanded, and that made sense because one of the prongs of the act for the legislature was to modernize outdated provisions in the law. So email use was tremendously expanded. One question that comes up all the time is, can the board vote by email? Supposedly we can do lots of things by email. Why can't the board vote? Or can the board vote? And in fact, under New York law, it's absolutely clear that the board of a nonprofit cannot vote by email. This is even more confusing because other jurisdictions, for instance, Delaware, allow the board to vote by email. But in New York, a board can never vote by email. What can the board do in terms of taking action by email? The board can consent by email. There are two ways a board can act, either at a meeting or by consent without a meeting. And that consent, if you're not going to have a meeting, it must be unanimous. There are two ways you can do it. You can do it the old-fashioned way, unanimous written consent, where an action is set forth on a piece of paper or pieces of paper, and every director signs the consent. That's unanimous written consent. The second type of consent without a meeting is unanimous email consent. Note that in either case, the consent must be unanimous. If you're not going to have a meeting and the board's going to take action, and people trip over this all the time, the action without a meeting must be unanimous. And it must be unambiguous. That's another problem with email consents as well that we see. So if there are 10 people on the board, an email goes out, please indicate your consent to the following action by responding to this email with the words, I consent or I agree. So the response can't be, I agree, but I have a question on paragraph 12. So that's not a consent. That's ambiguous, and that wouldn't work. It's also not acceptable if, no matter how many directors you have, it's not acceptable for the consent to be anything but unanimous. Don't ever lose track of that word unanimous. So if the board is acting without a meeting, if it's by email or in writing, every single director has to consent. And if you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard me mention the real life instance that I had where I had a board with 50 people, 49 of them consented in writing to a very significant corporate action. The 50th was in a hospital in a coma, and because of that, and he recovered, so that's the good news. But because of that fact, those 49 consents were useless. That was not a board consent. Had another situation where the bylaws of an organization said that the board had 8 directors, and if 7 of the 8 consented in writing to any action, that was a valid action of the board. So for years, they operated by that standard, and in fact, that standard is contrary to the mandatory provisions of the law. Doesn't matter in that instance what your bylaws say, the law overrules it. Those consents had to be unanimous, and so all of those actions that 7 of the 8 took were invalid. And that gets to the effect of missteps. In this area, it seems pretty innocuous. Well, we had 49 out of 50, we had 7 out of 8. All of those actions are invalid, and in that 7 of 8, that matter came to me because the board was being sued, and one of the prongs of the suit was all those actions that the board took that 7 of the 8 directors consented to under the bylaws, A, were invalid, and B, the plaintiffs wanted the board to put back in the organization's bank account all the monies that were expended as a result of those actions, even though they were within the scope of permissible activities of the organization. Because the authorization was improper, the plaintiffs wanted the board, out of their own personal funds, to replenish those monies. So the effect of missteps in this fairly what seems like a fairly innocuous area could be quite far-reaching. So third governance, third in the top 10 of governance snafus is properly documenting corporate action. And again, this came up in Ken's presentation, and there were a couple of questions about it. Minutes are critical in so many different ways. Minutes can be too detailed, or they can suffer from having too little detail. My approach to minutes is that I look at the minutes as a checklist to demonstrate that the board fulfilled its fiduciary duties. That helps when an outsider is looking at the minutes, like if we get hired to sue a board or to think about suing a board, one of the first things we want to look at is the minutes. Similarly, if your organization, hopefully this will never happen, but if you're being investigated by the Attorney General or another regulator, one of the first things that they're going to ask for, and if you don't give it to them, they will subpoena all of your minutes. And so it's very useful for the board and the board's advisors to approach the minutes as a checklist to fulfill the fiduciary duties of the board. And so that way, if the minutes are being prepared or reviewed after the fact, even there, that can be a useful tool to say, well, wait a minute, we need to go back and do something else or approach something a different way, because when we look at the minutes, we see that we really haven't fulfilled our fiduciary duties, or perhaps we have created some other problem that we need to address in future board action. In particular, the area of conflicts of interest and related party transactions have a very important nexus with minutes. As we alluded to, New York has these really demanding rules on how you handle conflicts of interest and related party transactions. And so think about it. If we have a related party transaction and we take all of the steps that the law requires us to take, we did a wonderful job, but it's not properly documented in our minutes. Well, 3 years from now, if somebody's suing us or investigating us, all those wonderful things that we did didn't really happen because there's no evidence that we followed the law and the appropriate procedures. So minutes really are critical in demonstrating that the board fulfilled its fiduciary duties, and very often overlooked. And I think, you know, I think it's clear that in any nonprofit context, people are not joining the board to spend their time carefully reading minutes, and they're not joining the board to become nonprofit governance geeks like I am. But in fact, you have to be, and that's really the only way that you can protect the organization and yourself if you're a nonprofit director or officer. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the intricacies of conflicts and related party transactions, just to give you a sense of how critical the minutes are. So one of the requirements in the not-for-profit corporation law with respect to related party transactions is not just that the board has to approve them, but the board has to make an affirmative finding that the proposed transaction was fair and reasonable and in the best interest of the organization at the time the board is acting. So that those I refer to as essentially magic words. They're in the statute, they're a requirement, and if you approve the transaction without the board reciting those magic words in the relevant resolution, you've breached your fiduciary duty and you haven't properly approved the transaction. And the only way that you can demonstrate that you did that is in the minutes. So that's an example of how important the minutes are. There are other really sensitive and important requirements involving conflicts of interest in related party transactions. Certain types of conflicts, for instance, a related party transaction in a charitable corporation where the director or officer has a substantial financial interest in the transaction, has a heightened voting threshold to approve the transaction, and also requires the board to look at alternative transactions. And again, if all of those things are not in the minutes, then they never happened, whether you did them or not. In addition, the minutes for any kind of conflict of interest have to show that the director or officer with the conflict was present and available to answer any questions that the board had, but then left the meeting. So even if it's a phone meeting, the minutes have to show that David Goldstein, who had a conflict of interest, was available to answer questions, answered questions, there were no questions, but then before the board began deliberations, David Goldstein left the call. And if you don't do that, again, you've blown it, and that's got to be in the minutes. And these kinds of seemingly innocuous governance missteps are all over litigation relating to nonprofits. So keep that really at the forefront, because it's something that comes up over and over again. So another governance snafu. Any questions? I don't want to race past. Okay, good. So another governance snafu that we see all the time, it involves the annual meeting. The law requires, and in your materials are the sections of the law, section 519 and section 513A of the non-for-profit corporation law. They require an annual meeting of the board. If you've got members, it's an annual meeting of the members. What happens at the annual meeting, there are two things that under the law have to happen at every annual meeting. First, the election of directors, and second, the delivery of an annual financial report. The election of directors can either be the election of the full board or a particular class. There are two ways to structure a board. One is where the whole board has a one-year term and is elected at each annual meeting. And the alternative, which is very popular for a number of good reasons, is having annual classes. So most commonly, boards are divided into three classes, and directors are elected for a 3-year term, and that's a mechanism that boards find most comfortable and most amenable to the efficient operation of the organization. You can have up to a 5-year term, but keep in mind what you can't do, and again, it's technical, but it's a requirement of the law. You can't elect your whole board for a 3-year term and then not have another annual meeting for 3 years. You can't do that. If you want directors to have a 3-year term, it's got to be a third of the board that's elected every year, and then each director has a 3-year term. The annual financial report has very specific information required under the law, and that's a vital provision to fulfill, because if you don't do it, it sets the board up for breach of fiduciary duty. Again, duty of obedience, duty of care. As we discussed earlier, the statute says this is the information that the board has to provide every year in the annual report. If you don't do it, bad things happen, and a claimant, either a regulator or an internal claimant, can say that those bad things happen because you didn't provide the required financial information. Question?
Yes, on the annual financial report, most times at the end of the year or the beginning of the next year when you're having your annual meeting, the financial report isn't prepared at that point, right? Isn't it audited later? So does it have to be at the annual meeting, or can it be later at a separate meeting as long as you do it annually?
Really good question. And the answer is it has to be at the annual meeting, because the annual meeting is a very prescribed event under the law. However, the good news and the bad news is that you can use financial information that's not more than 6 months old. So that's another thing that nonprofits trip over. So a lot of my clients, because they get the right advice, make sure to have their annual meetings before the end of June. If they're year end, they've got 6 months. The financial information can't be more than 6 months old. So June is one of my busiest months, because I'm racing from one annual meeting to another, because clients are trying to give their auditors and their staff enough time to put the information together and get it audited and present it as part of the annual report before the end of June. So you've got 6 months, but not more. Okay, so question?
We were advised by our attorneys that it's okay to split the financial meeting and the election meeting. And we have in our bylaws now, that were recently revised, that we actually have two annual meetings, one in June, which is the annual election meeting, at which time we elect directors on the 1/3 schedule that you suggested. And then we have a second meeting, the annual financial meeting in November, when we have the 990 to approve. And we were advised that that was perfectly fine. Is that not right?
Do you have your calendar year filer, meaning that your fiscal year ends 12/31? June 30th, okay. So the statute is really clear. It says that you've got to have an annual meeting. You have to do these two things at the annual meeting. I would have them at the same time. I'd follow the statute. I wouldn't give anybody the argument that I didn't follow the statute. I would follow the statute because the statute has a mandatory provision that says this is what you have to do. But really keep in mind, and you guys are doing that. Maybe just move your election to November, and then you're covered. Okay, I want to hit. We have another question. Yeah.
There's a question from the webinar. Does the delivery of the annual financial report at the annual meeting apply to nonprofits of all sizes?
Great question, and yes, it does. And I'm glad that question came up because our committee of the State Bar Association, the Committee on Nonprofit Corporations, has asked the Attorney General and the legislature to exempt small nonprofits from not particularly this requirement, but some of the other requirements, in particular involving conflicts. And the policy decision has been that we're not exempting anybody from anything based on size. This is relevant to all nonprofits. So if you're a $500 million a year nonprofit or a $50,000 a year nonprofit, this applies to you. So I want to hit on real quick. I'll go through a bunch of other key governance snafus. One is the IRS Form 990. I just would want to highlight that when it's signed, the signer is saying, under penalties of perjury, this is the certification on the 990. I declare that I've examined this return, including accompanying schedules and statements, and to the best of my knowledge and belief, it is true, correct, and complete. And the Attorney General, when they do investigations of nonprofits or litigations involving nonprofits, including, by the way, the Trump Foundation litigation and the recent decision is in your materials. So you should take a look at that. It's a very important case. And was just finally resolved in early November, a few weeks ago. The 990 played a critical role in establishing the breaches of fiduciary duty by the Trump Foundation board. And it's one of the first things that litigants look at, one of the first things that regulators look at, and donors look at it as well. It's very common. I do a lot of work for private foundations, and one of the things that my private foundation clients do, without telling the nonprofits that they're considering funding, is they have me look at some basic public information that's available about the nonprofit, and that disqualifies most of the nonprofits that they're looking at before they even get to the next round. And usually it's the 990 that has information that on its face is careless or inaccurate, that a funder can see without even doing a lot of research. And 990s are publicly available, both on the Attorney General's website and on other websites like GuideStar. And you should also know that the 990s are digitized and reviewed by both the IRS and the Attorney General for red flags. And as I said, they're public and used both by claimants with an agenda and by regulators and by donors. And this is a quote from a recent Attorney General enforcement action, not the Trump Foundation litigation, but another litigation. The IRS 990s and financial statements containing this false and misleading information were routinely made available to the public through the Charities Bureau and other sources. So you submit your 990, it goes on the Charities Bureau website, and now they've participated in spreading the false information that's in the 990 if it's not right, and that doesn't make them very happy. So I'm going to just sail through these really quickly. The certificate of incorporation trap. Ken alluded to this. Your certificate of incorporation has your corporate purposes, and the primary duty of a nonprofit director, the single most important duty, is to make sure that your charitable assets are used only for your mission. So if your mission evolves and you're doing wonderful things, but it's not what's in your certificate of incorporation, you have breached your fiduciary duty as a director and you have personal liability. And so I refer to that as the certificate of incorporation trap. The bylaws trap, we talked a little bit about that before. Bylaws bylaws tend not to be reviewed by regulators. So they're very easy to change, which is how you can get a provision in your bylaws that is completely inconsistent with the law. For instance, 7 of 8 directors can consent to an action without a meeting. And that's the bylaws trap. It's too easy to change your bylaws, and you should change them and you should update them, but those changes should be in consultation with your attorney, and they should be undertaken very carefully, because you can wind up in a situation where your bylaws are inconsistent with the law. So let's see, the NPCL trap, not-for-profit corporation law, and we've hit on a couple of these. There are tons of what we in the trade call traps for the unwary that are kind of hidden in the law. So for instance, when you approve officer compensation, let's say for your executive director, that's not by the normal voting threshold that exists in the law. There's in fact a supermajority voting requirement that applies to the approval of officer compensation. There are rules about establishing an executive committee. There are supermajority quorums for removal of a director. There are all kinds of rules around member notice if you have members. And if you're ever getting to the point where you're dissolving voluntarily, there are all sorts of hidden traps around that. For instance, no matter what your notice provision is in your bylaws, if you've got members and you're dissolving, you need to provide, and directors too, you need to provide a 30-day written notice, and that notice has to be sent by certified mail, return receipt requested. So a process trap is basically refers to that there's all kinds of process around things that you might not expect. For instance, nonprofits very often update their mission, and they do it by making changes to their bylaws, but that doesn't work because the purposes in your certificate of incorporation are what governs, not the mission statement in your bylaws. So there's a process and you need to follow it. Do we have a question? Yes.
We're in the process right now of amending our bylaws. And my question is, we had 4 founding members who are invited to the annual meeting every year. However, they're not sitting on the board currently. They're just recognized as founding members. 2 are living, 2 are deceased. When we amend the bylaws, do they have to be notified? Especially one was a creator of the bylaws. She's an attorney. So does she get to vote on the new bylaws?
It really depends on what their status is, and that gets to a little of some of the things that came up in Ken's presentation is who's on the board, who's an advisory board, who's a member. So that's something that you really have to go over with your attorney, and it's by reference not only to the bylaws, but also to the provisions of the not-for-profit corporation law. So that's a very good example of how you've really got these multiple inputs that need to be considered. You can't just look at the bylaws. You need to actually look at the bylaws, certificate of incorporation, because that might have a relevant provision, and the not-for-profit corporation law, and determine what their status is and what rights that gives them.
Hi, David.
Hi.
2 quick questions. One, can you ever have a member of your audit committee who is not a board member? If you don't have the talent for the financial talent on your board, especially for grassroots, can you have somebody who is not on the board?
Okay, great question. That's actually a couple of slides later, but we're not going to have time for it, so I'm glad you raised it. Absolutely not. You can have a non-voting advisor on the audit committee, but they're not a true member of the committee because only board members can have a vote on a board committee. And committees, and that was in fact 10, that's snafu number 10, is the committees are an incredibly complicated area, very technical and detailed under the statute. And one of the technical requirements is that for a board committee like the audit committee, you have to have at least 3 voting members, and all of the voting members must be board members, no exceptions.
The other quick question is, I just got one on my desk, a grassroots organization that has 2 board members and one's the founder and there's no secretary. How bad is that?
That's very bad on multiple levels, but the easiest one, the lowest hanging fruit there, is the law requires a minimum of 3 board members. So every decision that that board is taking can be challenged, and the directors can be sued personally and have personal liability. By definition, that's very easy. So, you know, they should fix that right away.
David?
Yes.
One more question.
Okay.
As an organization's mission evolves or changes, what can be done with the certificate of incorporation to make sure that you're in line with that? Can you amend it?
You can amend it, and I'm probably at least half a dozen amendments that we're working on right now without any names. Some of them are sitting in this room, and it's vital that you amend your purposes as your mission evolves. But again, there's a process, and the last thing you should ever do is amend the mission statement in your bylaws. Frankly, I make most of my clients take their mission statement out of the bylaws completely, because it's too easy to fall into the trap of amending it there, and it really has no effect. The only one that counts is what's in your certificate of incorporation. If you're a charitable nonprofit, you need to get Attorney General consent for the amendment. There's a whole internal process before you get the Attorney General consent. Sometimes you need regulatory agencies to consent. One of my clients, who's also sitting here today, needed 12 regulatory agencies to consent to their certificate of amendment because they were active in so many areas, and it was a lengthy process, but that's the only way you can do it. And it needs to be done, because if you don't do it, then all of the vital work that you're doing, sometimes it's life-changing, sometimes it's life-saving. It's ironic, shocking, counterintuitive, scary that the board members can be sued personally for doing all those good things because their job was to make sure that the funds of the organization were used for something else. And so you just never want to get there. Okay, and I'll end with my mantra. Nothing that I've said is rocket science. Governance is not rocket science. It just really requires commitment and attention to detail. And so I think if there's one takeaway, it's that. Definitely look at the materials, including the decision in the Trump Foundation litigation, and right from the start, because that'll really give you a nice roadmap of what to do and what not to do. Thanks very much.
I have a feeling when David dreams, governance goes through his head. All right, so we're in the home stretch. I've got 28 slides in 30 minutes. So I apologize for this. Good thing is David covered some of my material. So we'll try to move this along on the stuff that he covered. So remember, as we've been saying, nonprofits are highly regulated entities with many legal compliance requirements, and they have to make sure that they're following best practices as organizations. And the board and management level policies are essential. So we're going to talk about some of those policies that exist. So they're kind of laid out there, and I'll kind of touch on them as I go through. So David mentioned a lot about meeting minutes. Remember that a lot of the policies that are kind of spelled out are things that are, bless you, are things that are specifically asked for within the 990. So David talked about the 990 and the importance of the 990 and the fact that someone's signing off on the 990 and certifying that the 990 is complete and accurate. Well, within the 990, there's a whole bunch of questions that talk about governance and policy related type things. So a lot of the policies that we're going to talk about are things that are popping out of that 990. And although in some of them you look at them and say, well, is that really important? Is it not important? Think about the impact of checking a no box in terms of, do you have this policy? No. Well, it may not be required, but implications of not having it might be bad. So in terms of the minutes, remember they have to be contemporaneously drafted, and the IRS defines contemporaneous as either by the date of the next meeting or 60 days, whichever is closer. All right, so you basically, if you're meeting once a month, you basically have to have the minutes ready by the next meeting. If you're meeting once a quarter, you have 60 days to get the minutes, because the person who's writing the minutes, the board secretary, usually, needs to make sure that they remember what was said and everything else. So it has to be done within 60 days. The frequency of meetings will be outlined within the bylaws of the organization. A lot of times we see organizations that are meeting a couple times a year. I like organizations to meet at least quarterly. Depending on the nature of the organization and how important information is, it might be more than quarterly, but at least quarterly would be great. Frank, you have a question?
At our board meetings, we record the meeting, and then the minutes are made from that recording. Is there any advice about the recording that you could give? Should we keep it, delete it, get rid of it?
I would get rid of it after the minutes are put together. And the reason I would get rid of it is because it provides extra information that's not spelled out within the minutes. And it could be fodder for David, who's trying to sue the organization, because he sues all organizations.
Thank you.
Minutes are meant to be document actions taken, and they provide official records. Remember, this is the official record. As David mentioned earlier, when he gets asked to look at an organization, the first thing he does is chime in and look at minutes. If the state attorney general comes in and looks at you, they're going to look at the minutes. Any of your regulatory agencies, any audits, one of the things that we see, because we work a lot with nonprofit organizations, when governmental agencies come in to do an audit, the first thing they ask for is the minutes of the organization. So those minutes of the organization need to be appropriate. There's certain things that should be in every set of minutes, which is kind of listed there. As David mentioned, sometimes minutes can be too detailed, sometimes they could be too broad. You're actually trying to, do that whole, three bears thing. It shouldn't be too soft, too hard. It should be just right. And that's kind of what you're trying to aspire to. Some of the things that definitely should be reflected in the minutes. Things like if you're having from a finance perspective, you want to be talking about, the budgets, that the budget was approved, so that everybody knows that there was a roadmap that was kind of put out by the board and it's been approved. Contracts, if there are any major contracts that the board is required, because remember, every organization is going to do things differently. Some organizations, as part of their policies, require the board to have a certain role, and some organizations, according to their policies, are going to push more of that role down to management. If the board has a role to approve certain contracts and stuff, well, if that contract is being approved, it has to be done then at the board level. So you really have to go through and understand how your organization has laid out the hierarchy of what needs to be done. Financial performance should be discussed at the board, because again, if there's a question as to whether the board had an understanding of the fiscal and whether the the board is providing proper fiscal oversight of an organization, you want that to be spelled out in the minutes, that the board is kind of looking over things. From a human resource perspective, again, if the board is involved in any critical hiring, such as the executive director, if there are compliance issues that the board is focusing on, those should be discussed. Technology, questions, facilities, so if the board has to approve any leases or has to approve construction or anything like that, that should be spelled out. From a program performance perspective, metrics, compliance, funding source audits, any of that stuff that needs to be in there. The implication is that nonprofits who do not adequately document meetings are deficient, because again, what you hear all the time, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. All right, so kind of think in terms of, that the minutes are part of what the minutes are a, cover your butt thing. So if it's not in the minutes, it didn't happen. You got a question?
Good thing I attended this. I'm the recording secretary. We have reports sent by email from the executive director, the president. Do they have to be attached to the minutes?
David, you're in probably a better position to answer that question legally. I'll tell you what I feel, but
Yes, is the short answer. Really, everything that's an exhibit to the minutes, it should really reflect the reports that were delivered at the board meeting. And it goes to what Ken said, right? I mean, it shows appropriate oversight. We didn't just talk about it. We looked at, we received this information, we analyzed this information, and because of that, sometimes my minutes have 10 or 12 exhibits and are 75 or 80 pages long. But again, it shows that the board fulfilled its oversight function and did its fiduciary duty.
For those of you who are attending the webinar, that was a ghost speaking. Moving along, public disclosure of information. So one of the important things is the IRS requires that nonprofits make certain documents available. Those documents are your 1023 application or your 1024 if you're not a 501c3. How many of you guys know where your 1023 application actually is? A couple of you. That document is open to public inspection. If somebody wanted to, they could reach out to your organization, say, I'd like to see a copy of your 1023 application and all of the backup support that went with that 1023 application, and you'd have to present it to them within a timely period. So that's one place where we see a trip up. Also, the Form 990 is a public document. As David mentioned, the 990 is on GuideStar. It's on the State Attorney General's website. It's on a few other websites. But again, if someone came into your organization and say, I want a copy of the 990, you'd have to be able to provide them to it, a copy. Now, understand that there are certain parts of the 990 that are not open up to public inspection, the most important of which is Schedule B. So Schedule B of the 990 is where all of your donors' information is listed. So just make sure if you ever go to GuideStar and check out your 990 or go to the Attorney General's office website, your Schedule B will not be on that website. So if you have a copy of the 990 in your office that's available for anybody to come in to make a copy of, make sure you strip Schedule B out of there. The last thing you want to be doing is passing around your donor list to somebody who's asking. So just make sure Schedule B is not in there because it is not required. As I said, the 1023 application is a required document. Included in that 1023 application, you're going to be giving copies of your bylaws. You're going to be giving a copy of your conflict of interest statement. So if you think that the conflict of interest statement is sheltered, it's not. So if somebody is unhappy with you and they want to see a copy of your conflict of interest statement, all they have to do is ask for your 1023 application, because that's one of the required pieces that you send in with your 1023 application. So, somebody can get copies of any of that stuff. Moving along, I mean, again, in today's environment, transparency is extremely important. So one of the things that you may want to do, even going back to the previous slide, you may want to decide to put some of these documents on your own website, and then you can just direct people to your website, in terms of the 990s and stuff like that. Document retention and destruction is, again, another important policy that organizations should have. And every organization is going to be different in terms of what that document retention and policy looks like. So if you just went online and you grabbed the document retention policy, do me a favor, go through it and make sure it applies to your organization. So if to give you an example, if you're a school and you're working with young children, okay, so you're working within the early intervention 0 to 3 or preschool 3 to 5, the requirement is that you have to hold on to those records for those children until they reach the age of majority, and then they have to have enough time under the statute of limitations to sue you if you did something wrong. So, you might have to hold on to records for 25 years or, 24 years. So make sure that your document retention policy is reflective of your operations. And just don't assume because I downloaded one off the web, it's good. Some things to keep in mind in terms of that is, again, it's not a legally required document, but again, it's on the 990, so one of the things you definitely want to do. So here's kind of some benchmarks, but just keep in mind that these are benchmarks. So permanent maintenance, there's certain things that you want to kind of keep forever. So obviously you want to have whatever your most recent bylaws are. You want to have minutes of the board of directors, as David mentioned. You want to hold on to those minutes. If you're in a situation where you have debt instruments or significant purchases, You may not keep it forever, but you want to definitely make sure that you keep it over its useful life. So let's say if I have a building, and as long as I continue to use that building, I want to hold on to the documents. Once I stop using the building, then that's when the clock starts ticking in terms of the 7-year hold. If you have a lease or debt or any of those things, again, once they end, then you really want to start the clock in terms of the 7-year hold. For most accounting records, it's 7 years. For most things like deposit slips, employment applications, general correspondence, emails, it's 3 years. That's just kind of a general rule of thumb. But again, make sure that you look at your organization and understand what the needs within your organization. Also, from a technology perspective, a lot of organizations have been scanning the information into their into the cloud and holding it on the cloud. Just a couple of things to keep in mind. Whenever you're dealing with cloud-based information, you have to worry about a whole bunch of new things. Not that you didn't have to worry about them when they were paper, but you have to worry about things like HIPAA, right? So if you're dealing with any personal information out there, you got to worry about HIPAA compliance. You got to worry about, if you're a school, you got to worry about FERPA compliance. If you're dealing with cloud, you have to worry about does somebody have access to it? How often? What are the safety protocols within the cloud? How often is that information, backed up? If you're in a situation where, information needs to be removed, how easy or readily can you remove that information so that you're not holding on to, 30, 40, 50 years of information? You only have the requisite number of years you need. There's some programs like a lot of the accounting software, which now you can actually scan the invoices right into the software and attach them to the checks that you're writing, so that detail is there. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use it. Just again, keep in mind that when you're now deleting information or trying to get rid of information, there's new rules or new ways of doing it. David talked a little bit about the Form 990. Again, I want to stress and agree with David that it's very, very important. It's one of the traps that we see all the time. It's very important that 990 gets looked at on a regular basis. When I think about it, the 990 is the document that is most often reviewed by the outside world. That is the face of the organization in a lot of cases. So you should kind of treat it that way. One of the things that we like to tell our clients is not only should you use it to get information out there in terms of compliance, but I would also say that you should use it as a marketing tool. On page 2 of your Form 990, you outline your program service accomplishments. And a lot of times organizations have their accountants fill out the 990. Oh, get the accountant to do it. Problem when you have the accountant do it is they are looking at it from a compliance document. So one of the things you may want to do is actually have your marketing or your program people completing aspects of the 990, like I said, specifically page 2, which talks about your program service accomplishments, to talk about your impact and everything else. Because if this is the document that's going out there that people are going to kind of latch hold of and say, all right, do I want to donate to this organization? Do I want to support this organization? The more information you can put out on that 990, in terms of your program accomplishments, the better. I would also say that one of the things we see a lot is, one of the questions that's on the 990 is board reviewing the 990 before the 990 is filed. What does that board review process look like? I think in most organizations, what ends up happening is, the board gets the 990 the day it's due, if they get it at all. They spend about 3 seconds in a meeting saying, hey, does anybody have any questions about the 990? No, good, okay, move on, approved. That 990, as David mentioned, has information in it that's important information. One of the things that David looks at when he's helping private foundations is to see whether that 990 is completed accurately. And if they're not completed accurately, that could impact your ability to get funding. And we see all the time when we look at 990s that there are problems within those 990s. So one of the things you want to make sure is, that you do have adequate time. And I would actually set protocols in terms of what those procedures are, outline what those procedures are. Those get documented on the 990, but they should also be reflected within the organization's policies. And that review of the 990 should be clearly outlined within the minutes of the board of directors. Another big thing is executive compensation. Executive compensation is probably one of the biggest areas that's looked at within the 990. And there's one of the questions on the 990 asks, did the process for determining compensation of the following persons, CEO and other officers, include a review and approval by independent persons, comparability data, and contemporaneous substantiation of the deliberation decision? How many of you guys have executive directors? How many of the executive directors, is there a process to review the executive director and review the compensation? So a few of you, yeah. Do you have a separate committee that does that, or is that done at the board level? Board level, okay. Committee, so I got some committees, I got some board. So again, it comes down to what is that process? How often is that compensation looked at? That's important, and that's one of the things that kind of needs to be spelled out. One of the things that I look at it from a executive comp perspective is if you're just going to be giving a cost of living increase, so if you've gone through the process, determined that executive comp is appropriate, and you're just going to be giving a cost of living increase, you probably don't have to go through a salary study again in the following year. I would say you probably need a salary study once every 3 years if you're really just going with cost of living increases and your raises are comparable to the rest of your staff. But if you're going to be giving any more than just a cost of living increase, you probably want to document how you got to that salary level so that there's no questions. Remember, there's a whole bunch of rules that exist at the IRS level in terms of intermediate sanctions. If it's determined that the compensation you're paying to your executives is too high, they could be subject to penalty, and the board could be subject to penalty if they knowingly provided too much compensation to an individual. So you want to make sure that there's a clear understanding of how that number was derived. What was the salary study that was performed? And again, when you think about salary studies, there's a discussion here. You want to look at organizations that have similar attributes, similar geography, same type of nonprofit, same size of nonprofit. When I do a salary study, I like to look at 20 to 25 comparable agencies. And sometimes it's hard to find 20 to 25 agencies that look exactly like your organization. So what I would suggest there is try to just normalize. So sometimes I'll work with ones that are a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, but I'll try to normalize it. So what I'll do is I'll take salary per employee of the organization. So if I've got, my organization has 25 employees and another organization might have 40, I can figure out salary per employee. I can figure out salary per $1,000 of revenue, salary per $1,000 of expense. And now I start to normalize things and I can develop a range of where that salary should be. And then that becomes my starting point for determining the compensation. If you're going to go beyond that range of salary that was kind of worked up through that, then one of the things that you want to look at then is why. Why are you giving more compensation? David and I worked on a situation recently where the individual is in a country, they spend the majority of their time in a country that is in almost like a war zone. And what we were able to do is, based upon federal guidelines outline certain countries that they offer, depending on the zone type, increases in the compensation the federal government will pay to people in those countries. And we use that as a basis for saying that the person deserves more money than what the salary range worked up to be. And there could be other factors. There could be factors as the ability to bring in fundraising dollars. Maybe somebody has special skills that enables them to more effectively run the organization because they have a deeper understanding of the mission of the organization. So it really is going to come down, but whatever you're going to choose and however you're going to do it, it has to be documented, and it has to be contemporaneously documented, and it needs to be outlined and spelled out.
One quick note, just to give a little substance and make more tangible what Ken is talking about. In the materials you have in tab 13, the first page of tab 13 is part 6 of the 990. It's one page and it's entitled Part 6, Governance, Management, and Disclosure. And it has a lot of the information that Ken is talking about, and you can see it right there on the face of the 990. And when I look at a 990, I look at exactly what Ken is talking about. I look at the description of the mission and the activities at the beginning of the 990, and I look at part 6. Those are the first things I look at, and that really gives me a very strong sense of what the organization is about and their level of compliance.
One of the other things that you have to think about from an executive comp perspective is Executive Order 38. For anybody who doesn't understand Executive Order 38, if somebody is making over $199,000 as the executive director of an organization or as an executive administrative person of an organization, and they're getting state-funded dollars, they might be subject to Executive Order 38, which puts limits on the amount of compensation that the executive can earn. Executive Order 38 has a safe harbor that as long as you're in the bottom 75th percentile based on a salary study of comparable organizations, you're in a safe harbor. Last week, anybody here funded by the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities? Last week, OPWD just sent out a notice that said that if you're using state funds, either state originated funds or state pass-through funds, that you're limited to the 199, and they did away with the safe harbor in theirs. So you don't get to do a salary study and see if you're in the bottom 75th percentile. If you do want to get paid more, or your executive director is getting paid more than 199, you actually have to submit a waiver to OPWD and the Division of Budget and request permission. So anybody who's OPWD funded, there's new rules that have come out within the last week. And when I called up OPWD to find out, does that mean for this current year, or does that mean the next year after the rules went into effect? I was told, I don't know, mail me a letter and I'll figure it out for you. Wow. And I said, that's exactly what I said, wow. And they said, what do you mean, wow? And I said, I can't email you. And they said, what, you don't write letters? And I said, the Stone Age passed about how many? And they said, wow. So we had a wow conversation. You have a question over there?
Yes. So does the executive board, sort of a two-parted, can the executive board be compensated like the officers on the executive board? And also, if I'm looking to start a private nonprofit, and I want to invest my own funding capital, what is the process for that?
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip that question. I'm going to talk to you after the fact about it, but in terms of compensation of boards theoretically can be compensated. I don't advise boards being compensated at all. Actually, what we talked about earlier is boards should be giving to the organization, not taking from them, in my opinion. But I will answer your questions after it's over. Just in the interest of time, I just want to kind of move this along. David mentioned conflict of interests, probably the most important policy out there. The New York State requires that nonprofits adopt a conflict of interest policy with certain prescribed elements. One of the things that David, I don't know that David did or did not mention, a lot of times you could have a conflict of interest policy and then your bylaws could have a conflict of interest policy in them. And sometimes they don't equal each other. So just also be careful that, you know, if you have a conflict of interest policy, I think David normally advises to take the conflict of interest out of the bylaws and just have a separate policy so that you don't have to worry about them being not in sync. The policy must cover conflicts. So you should define what a related party is as part of your policy and everything else. Some organizations totally prohibit related party transactions as part of their policy. I don't agree with the concept of just unilaterally saying no related party transactions, because a lot of related party transactions are actually good. If someone said to you, hey, I've got 50,000 square feet of space that you can have for $1 a month, would you take it if you needed it? Yeah, probably. It's a conflict if they're a board member of yours, but it's a good conflict. So as David said, you have to, even if it's $1, you still have to go through the process of analyzing it. What's the cost? How much is that appropriate? What's fair market value? And then use the magic words that David said in terms of whether it's agreed to or not. So again, not all conflicts are bad. That's what I want you to take out of that. There's some things that a conflict of interest policy must include. They're kind of laid out here. And I think David kind of covered some of these. So I want to get into some of the other policies that I think are equally important. Whistleblower. How many of you guys have a whistleblower policy? So a few of you. That's good. It's one of the things that came out of Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002. So Sarbanes-Oxley governs for-profit entities, and there are two principles that came out of Sarbanes-Oxley that don't just impact for-profits, they also impact nonprofits. One of them was that you can't retaliate against a whistleblower. And the second is destroying of evidence. So this whistleblower statute has been around since 2002. Every nonprofit organization is required to have a whistleblower policy. And it's amazing how often we find that organizations don't have whistleblower policies. So one of the things to kind of keep in mind from a compliance perspective, the whistleblower policy is kind of put in play so that if somebody sees something, it's almost like the MTA. If you see something, say something, right? So that's really what the purpose of the whistleblower policy is. And it's really designed to tell people, look, if you see something that's out there that's wrong, whether it be an error, whether there's fraud, whether there's inappropriate behavior, you're supposed to report it, okay? How many of you guys receive Medicaid funding in excess of $500,000? So a couple of you. So those of you who are getting Medicaid funding in excess of $500,000, you know that you need to have a Medicaid compliance officer. And part of the job of the Medicaid compliance officer is to educate the board and the employees of the organization with respect to compliance and what to report and what's in and out of compliance. And part of that education is basically telling them if they see something that here's how they can report it. And basically what you're doing is you're going out there and creating a bunch of whistleblowers, which is fine if they keep it within the organization. But part of that also comes to the key TAM laws, which if somebody reports something to the government comes in and takes back money, they're entitled to a percentage of the money that the government takes back. So part of that education process is teaching people how to basically make money off your errors. Anyway, part of what you can't do is, back here, okay. You can't retaliate against the whistleblower. So if someone's acting in good faith and they're reporting something that's wrong, you can't retaliate against them. That's the whole concept of a whistleblower statute. So if someone is fired over it, chastised over it, treated differently, they have a case for a lawsuit against the organization. So it's really important that people within the organization understand what the rules and regulations are. How many of you guys have gift acceptance policies? I got one hand that goes up. Thank you for having all the policies. From a gift acceptance policy is really, you want to be in a situation, let me just see which page I'm on, page 17, okay. They're growing in popularity in recent years. One of the things that you want to kind of look at from a gift acceptance perspective is what type of gifts are you willing to accept? That's really what it is. So if someone said to you, I want to donate a boat to your organization worth $30,000, is your organization prepared to take a boat? You know, who's going to pay for maintenance? How are you going to get it to where it needs to go? So what you want to really do is you want to kind of look at it and say, okay, these are the types of gifts we're willing to accept. We're willing to take cash, we're willing to take stock, we're willing to take what? You know, so that should be spelled out in the gift acceptance policy so that you know beforehand. So if someone comes to you and says, I want to donate this to you, you can then say, well, sorry, we don't accept that, or we do accept it because it's spelled out in the policy. Part of that gift acceptance policy should also look at if someone were to donate stock to you, what are you going to do with the stock? Do you have a brokerage account set up already, or do you not? So can you handle that stock coming into your organization? And what's your policy? Do I keep the stock? Do I sell it right away so I automatically liquidate the stock? What happens? So all of those things are things that should be spelled out within your gift acceptance policy. Any questions on any of this stuff? I know I'm moving fast, sorry. In terms of if your organization takes in-kind donations, so let's say you have a thrift store or you happen to be Cars for Kids, you know, you have those commercials all the time, and you're taking those gifts. What type of those gifts do you take? I mean, if someone says to you, I've got 20 bags of clothing, do you automatically take those 20 bags of clothing and then sort them out and throw away what's not usable? Or so what's the policy? I know that there's an organization that accepts used furniture and stuff like that. And what they'll do is they'll go and they tell everybody, you know, we're more than happy to look at the furniture, but if it's not something that's usable, we're not going to take it. So they've trained their staff on what's usable, what's not usable, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. So yeah, things that should be spelled out within the policy and the like. Reserves. This goes back to your question earlier regarding business versus nonprofit. Nonprofit organizations should be trying to establish reserves within the organization. And again, the board sets policy. So what sort of policy is the board setting? So, I mean, if I'm an organization and I want to make sure that, let's say I have loan covenants and the loan covenant's going to require me to have 30 days of cash on hand, I want to maybe set a policy that we work towards getting that 30 days on cash, or that we set a policy where we can't go below the 30 days. So, you know, the board may establish reserve levels for that. The board may say, hey, look, we want to build a building and we want to set up, you know, reserves for capital expansion. We may be a school and have scholarships. So the board may say, I want to designate certain funds for scholarship reserves. So the board can actually designate funds to establish reserves within the organization, which basically is earmarking those funds for that particular use, so that management knows that those funds are really untouchable and those are funds that the board has set aside. Once the board designates it, remember, if the board designates any funds, those have to be spelled out within the minutes of the board. And if the board wants to undesignate those funds, the board has to then have that spelled out in the minutes too. So the minutes have to show designation and undesignation. I'm already over. Do people want me to stop, or can I get 5 more minutes? 5 more minutes, okay. Thank you. One of the things that we also have is endowment policies. So how many of you have heard of NYPMIFA, the New York Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act? So, of course, my hand raiser. So NYPMIFA, which was implemented back in September 17th, 2010, so we're looking at something that's almost 10 years old now, governs investments and governs endowments. And it's amazing how here we are 9 years into this, and organizations still get it wrong. Okay, so I just want to bring up a couple things. NYPMIFA, from an investment perspective, you have to have an investment policy in place. It requires an investment policy. You can say, well, I don't really have investments. All my money is cash. Cash is an investment. Okay, so you have to have an investment policy. And one of the things you have to do is you have to assess your investments on a regular basis. And you have to look at certain factors when you're assessing your investments. And they're all kind of laid out here. I'm not going to go through them all in detail. But just keep in mind that after you go back and you review your investments, there needs to be an affirmative statement at the board level that says that we believe that our investment strategy is appropriate based upon these criteria. Okay, so you have to kind of go through that process. And a lot of times, you know, boards will say to me, well, you know, I've got $10 million, but it's all sitting in cash, therefore I'm safe. Well, no, it's prudent. The word there is prudent. The New York Prudent Management of Institutional Fund Act. What's prudent? If I'm sitting on $10 million worth of cash and that represents 3 years worth of operations, is it prudent to leave it all in cash, or should some of that be invested in something other than cash? All right, so you really need to look at it, because you could be too aggressive, which is not prudent, or you could be too conservative, which is not prudent. Is it something I said? Oh. Okay. Thought it was me. I take all this seriously. From an endowment perspective, there are 2 ways that you can handle endowments. All right, so if the first thing you have to do is you have to go to the gift instrument from the donor, and you have to look at the gift instrument. If the gift instrument from the donor specifically says how you have to handle the endowment, then you must follow the gift instrument. If the gift instrument is silent, there are 2 ways that NYPMIFA allows you to handle an endowment. The first way that you can handle an endowment is you can hold the corpus in perpetuity, which basically means you can't spend the money. If I give you $1 million and I say, you know, here you go, here's $1 million to be used for a scholarship fund. If the board decides, because the donor was silent as to it, if the board decides that they're going to hold the corpus in perpetuity, then the corpus can't be spent. So if I have a bad year from an investment perspective, there's no scholarship made that year because I can't spend the corpus. The other way the board can do it is the board can say, we're going to establish a spending policy, and that spending policy needs to be created. And the spending policy may be something like, we're going to authorize that we can spend 5% of the funds over a 4-year average. So they'll look at the average of the funds over 4 years, take 5% of it, and that's what can be spent in a given year. Understand why a board would want to do that. Let's go back to that scholarship example I said. I set up a scholarship fund at the school I went to, and I say I want a scholarship to go every year for an accounting student, right? And if the portfolio is down and there's no below the corpus, there's no scholarship going for that accounting student. But if I have a spending policy that allows me to invade the corpus, I can give a scholarship that year for the accounting student. So that's something to keep in mind. So it's the board who decides that if the document, that the gift document is silent. A couple things to keep in mind with respect to that. So endowment funds are donor restricted. Board funds are quasi-endowments. The endowments remain restricted until they're appropriated for expenditure. That's a key term, appropriated for expenditure. The board has to appropriate funds for expenditure. So the board minutes must actually state that certain funds are being appropriated for expenditure. If the board doesn't state they're appropriated for expenditure, which basically means release from encumbrance, you can't use those funds. All right, so if you're following NYPMIFA, you have to appropriate for expenditure. Now, appropriate for expenditure doesn't mean you have to spend the funds. Doesn't mean you have to take the cash out and spend it. It just means you're unencumbering the funds so they're no longer part of that restricted endowment. Does that make sense? Now, in order to appropriate for expenditure, you have to go through another series of questions. And you have to document contemporaneously your decision-making. Because even though you're allowed to appropriate for expenditure certain funds, it may not be appropriate to appropriate for expenditure those funds. So again, you have to go through this. It has to be well documented that you went through this process and the decision that you made. Okay? And as I said, the organization must make contemporaneous record of its consideration of the factors. One of the other things that we see all the time is an organization might go out for an appeal to build an endowment. So they'll say, okay, we're going to go build an endowment. So take Holy Cross High School, who's going to go out and build an endowment. And they go and they say, all right, we're going to raise $10 million for a scholarship fund. So if they're going out to raise money for a scholarship fund, they need to have certain wording within the appeal. Because if the appeal doesn't have that wording, it's not in accordance with NYPMIFA. And that wording is right there. So if you look at the second bullet there, it says, unless otherwise restricted by the gift instrument pursuant to NPCL subsection 553B, the institution may expend so much of the endowment fund as it deems prudent after considering the factors set forth in NPCL subparagraph 553A. So that wording has to be in the solicitation. Because basically what you're doing is you're letting the donor know that the organization has taken a position where it can spend part of those funds. All right? So I know for some of you smaller organizations, you're not thinking about endowments right now, but something to keep in mind. The last thing I want to kind of touch on a little bit is joint ventures. We're seeing a lot more in terms of joint ventures in the nonprofit marketplace, whether that be working with other nonprofit organizations or whether that be working with for-profit entities. And if you're looking at things in terms of going through this joint venture, one of the things that your policy should talk about is how do the opportunities get reviewed and vetted? So if you're going to get into an opportunity, what's your review process? Is there a due diligence process that's required? How is the pricing determined? Who has the authority to bind the organization to these types of contracts? How are strategic partners determined? So how are you going to pick your strategic partners? How do you determine if it's in line with the organization's mission and allowable under its certificate of incorporation? So these are all things that you want to kind of think about when you're creating that policy.
Can you just give an example of a joint venture between two nonprofits, and specifically how they might each benefit, and then how do they figure out the financial arrangements and that sort of thing?
So there are organizations that do joint fundraising. There could be organizations where one organization is providing back office function. So I have a nonprofit like Free. Free does a lot where they work with other organizations where they provide executive leadership, they provide back office functionality for those organizations. The organization goes out, they have their own board, they have their own mission and everything else, but Free provides the back office function for those organizations. So, and the pricing is structured based upon what the organizations agree on is appropriate pricing and everything. But, you know, you do often have that. On the for-profit side, you could have like America's Vet Dogs. They have agreements with organizations that create dog food or dog toys. And, you know, it's a co-venturing of that where the company goes out and they sell it, but they use the name America's Vet Dogs and the product America's Vet Dog Approved or something like that. And again, how do you determine who you want to get in bed with in terms of the partnerships?
But is that considered, that's like public-private partnerships or something like that?
Yeah.
And is that that example you just gave, is that considered a gift as soft dollars, or is it soft dollars?
Typically, they're unrestricted dollars, so you can use them unless there's some restriction in the agreement. They're typically unrestricted. They typically come through as some sort of royalty income, and depending on what the organization's role in the process is, will determine whether they're subject to UBIT tax or not. So if the organization's taking an active role in the process, it could be subject to taxation. If they're not taking an active role, it may not be subject to taxation. You'd have to evaluate. But those are funds that can be used by the organization for any reason. Any other questions? There's me again, and that's Matt who wrote the slides. We look alike, so I'm actually playing him right now. Thank you everybody for coming. Within the folder, there's an evaluation form. Can you please fill out the evaluation form? We want to know if we got it right. We want to know if these are the types of topics you want to hear about. If there are other topics that you want to hear about, we want to know about it, because the only way we can ensure that you guys get the information you're looking for is for you guys telling us what it is you want from us. We're more than happy to do anything or talk about any topics you want. So just let us know. Thank you.